Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock, Managing Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors. Today, we're talking to a fellow podcaster. John Pidgeon is the co-host of the This Is Property podcast. He also runs two businesses, Solvere Wealth and Envisage Property. So he's a property educator and also runs a buyer's agent business as well. He describes it as two options: teaching someone to fish or going fishing for them. So we have a chat to him about the difference that he believes a buyer's agent can make as opposed to someone who self-educates. But we focus mostly on the self-education, some of the things that he believes people are getting wrong or they need to know, and especially the areas that people are spending their time on. That might be the barbecue or the locker room conversations, as John calls it, and the hot spotting or the locations. He says location is, of course, important, but it's only one part of the greater strategy. It's an awesome interview with John, who, as I mentioned, is an accomplished podcaster and author as well. So it's a real pleasure to introduce John. John Pidgeon, thanks for joining me on Geared for Growth.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
Now, if I was to put you in a little box that sort of aligns with your business and your passions, it really kind of, it heads to property education. That's sort of where you do, I think, your best work in the space, obviously as a podcast host and with your business as well. What sort of what inspired you to educate people in and around property?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if we strip it back, I've always been passionate about helping people, and early days, qualified teacher, was a phys ed teacher for a number of years and then went into the fitness industry, but I always had a passion for investing in property, but also educating and coaching. So when I came out of the fitness industry and into property itself, it was a no-brainer that I wanted to be helping people to and further educate them in the investment space. So yeah, it's just I suppose like anyone who educates, it's about helping others to do to achieve what they want and create a lifestyle of it. But the feeling that you get of making a difference to someone's life is powerful.
Yeah, I've always kind of, I guess, had a little bit of jealousy about my connection to a property investor's wealth journey. Of course, no one likes paying tax, and I can help them to some degree, but, you know, it's 10x more meaningful in that sort of side of that. Yeah. Are there people that have sort of stood out that have come sort of to you and really were a little bit green and you were able to educate them and they've been able to fundamentally change their kind of financial trajectory that stick in your memory?
Yeah, I think it's a common perception out there that the great Aussie dream, buy our own home, spend the next 30 years paying it off and contribute to super and live happily ever after. And I think whilst that might have been half applicable in the 70s and 80s, early 90s, it's the game's changed a lot now. So I think there's a lot of clients that have come to us saying, well, hang on a minute, this great Aussie dream thing, maybe I need to do something a little bit different. And what's this whole equity business about, and how do we take advantage of that and still have a lifestyle? So yeah, there's many stories that say, well, we came from buying our first investment to then building a portfolio where we've now got choices in the space of 5 to 10 years. As you know, property is not an overnight success thing, so it really needs to have the mindset of the long game, but just being able to educate them about the long game. And I think that the most underrated fact in property is the cash flow and not having to sell property prematurely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a get-rich-slow sort of scheme. You touched on this very, very pervasive and perhaps persuasive notion that exists in property, and that sort of comes from perhaps the generation before us, and that is pay off your home as soon as you can because debt is terrifying and scary, and you want to get the bank out of the picture, and then, you know, superannuation is a relatively new thing in Australian working life, but it's kind of, that's the concert of the two. Why do you think that is such still a big, strong force in wealth creation today?
Look, it's the narrative, isn't it? The narrative that the government enforces, and as you mentioned, it is still reasonably new, but it's people see it as a safe alternative to be able to get their mitts off it and put it away and save it for a rainy day. And I think it's absolutely a strong way to develop wealth for the future. But I think the word future is exactly what it is. We can't touch it till we're into our 60s. So what can we do in the meantime? Because we don't know what's around the corner. Can we create wealth and lifestyle leading up to our 60s and then rely on super from that year on? And I think that's maybe the message that people are starting to listen to is I just want more now. I don't want to have to wait and for another 30 years to be able to enjoy my life and have some choices.
Mm. And I think the stats kind of say that the average super balance, obviously it depends and there's a broad spectrum, but there's a fairly strong argument to say that someone on, let's say, an ordinary wage, not even a modest wage, there's not necessarily going to be enough to live anywhere close to the lifestyle that they might have an expectation of if that's all they do is just the mandatory contributions into super, right?
Yeah, and that's the passion I have around that education piece. It's like what we listen to in the media or who we listen to at a barbecue or a water cooler. We maybe need to challenge or maybe think about the answers to that for our personal life and how it affects us. Because you're right, it may not be enough for a lot of people based on the cost of living and everything else. But I suppose I come back to four key pillars that I work with clients regularly is pay down our principal place, increase our cash, increase our assets, decrease our tax. So we can't do the fourth one unless we do the third. And those increasing of assets, well, super is one of those. Shares arguably is super in a way, and then you've got obviously property and or business. So we look at people's risk profile and say which game you're prepared to play and how aggressive do you want to be in that approach.
Mm. Now, you obviously have the education side of things with your Solvair business, but run a buyer's agency business as well. I'm interested in the interplay between those because for some people it will be, okay, this is the roadmap to go and do it myself. Some people will go, that's great. Others will go, gee, there's a lot more to this than I thought. There's no way I'm doing this myself. I need some help. Like, how do you kind of find the split of the spectrum between people that are like, with a bit of information and a roadmap, they're the go-getters that will do it, compared to the other people that are going like, I've just realized that all I've learned is that there's more that I don't know.
Yes, it's funny. You jump onto social media, and there's half saying you don't need a buyer's agent, the other half saying you do need a buyer's agent and they're too expensive and you should be able to do it yourself. It's not that hard, blah, blah, blah. And I can sit on both sides of the fence and have a smile, I suppose, because it is unique in the sense that we do cover both, but that's purely because we're passionate about helping people do that. And for those that say it's not that hard, well, it's not that hard if you're educated, but you've got to know what you don't know, sort of thing. And once it really comes back to people's lifestyle. If we got time on our hands to do that, great. If we haven't, then we probably need to outsource that. So it's I like the adage of, well, on one side we teach a person to fish, on the other hand we go and fish for them, and to have that flexibility in our business model, I think is extremely powerful. And it was born really out of I suppose, ignorance. I was just purely passionate about helping people and educating them, thinking that everyone would want to be educated. Why wouldn't you want to be told how
Yeah.
to go and find your own property? But 5, 6 years ago, I realised, well, hang on a minute, there's a massive piece of the world out there that says no, just go and do it for me, sort of thing. So we developed that side of things as well.
You raise a good point about how much time you've got to allocate to this wealth creation journey because, I mean, as you're growing a portfolio, it can be quite a big time commitment for someone that presumably has kind of a full-time job. For the people that do go it on their own, like how is there a guide to how much time you need to be spending on this?
There's usually two ends I see from a client perspective. There's one that procrastinates and always too busy to try and educate themselves. And then there's the other that goes gung-ho and really embraces it and gets it done. And ideally you want to be working with the latter, because they're the action takers and they're the ones that you can really make some serious inroads with. And I think early on in the process for us anyway, if we see that they're not moving at the pace that they should be moving at, then we just say, look, maybe you need to outsource that. And that's where obviously our other side of our business comes into it. But for those that do educate themselves through our systems and take action, like it's an extremely powerful skill and experience that they've got in their kit bag that they can pass on to generations. And that's the real enjoyment factor for me.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we talked a little bit about, there's a whole community, and we probably don't need to name names, but it's probably obvious to professionals that there are people saying, you don't need a buyer's agent. Others saying, the value of a buyer's agent is massive. For the people that do go through the education process, it sort of begs the question, if that's not your day-to-day business and your day-to-day job, can you outdo the performance that a highly credentialed and skilled buyer's agent might have? For example, just being someone that negotiates day in, day out on deals, you would think would be able to outperform the most highly educated person that maybe buys one property every 3 or 4 years. Is that fair to say? Like, where do you land on that sort of spectrum?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Mike, and I think we could debate for days in a community as to what the answer to that is. And I think, like any industry, I think if you've got professionals that are ethical and have good relations and basically know what they're doing and they've got experience in their corner, it's very hard to beat that. Because they're established relations that they can be much more efficient at what they're doing. And that's just any industry. It's not just buyer's agents. So I say to people, if you're going to be a weekend warrior and just go to open homes on weekends, you're not going to get the best outcome for yourself. But if you're prepared to put the work in and work on this on a daily basis and establish rapport and establish relations and know the tips and tricks to be able to knock some doors down, to apply your strategy to a particular market, you can get an outstanding result. There's no doubt about that. But I think that's a very small percentage that will actually do that, because, as we mentioned, lack of time, lack of resources, lack of even clarity on someone's strategy. Where do I buy? What's my price point? What's my yield? What type of property do I buy? We all look at location as the number one. It's actually the last point that I look at when I'm teaching someone.
Yeah, that's something that I think people maybe that listen to this show are sick of me saying. I talk about you can have your dessert, you got to eat your veggies first, and the dessert is the hot spotting. It's like, what am I going to buy? Where am I going to buy? But the veggies is the why am I buying? Like, how much can I afford to spend? Like, where am I trying to get to? What's the plan in doing that? And that kind of leads me to the question of, if someone's coming to you and they're like, John, I've spoken to someone at a barbecue and they've invested in property and they look happier and younger and have more money than me, and I want what they're having, what's the starting point for you, for someone that's not part of the property world, in educating to the point where they can start pulling the trigger on decisions that give them perhaps the life that they want?
The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Yeah, I work with a lot of professional sports people on an individual basis and also on a club level. And I call it the locker room talk. If you're sitting there next to someone in the locker room and they say, I've just gone and bought this, whether it be a car, whether it be a house, whether it be some shares, whatever, that is pretty much irrelevant to you. That's a story that we can just take on board. but don't apply that strategy to yourself because you're on probably different income, you're probably different age, you've got a different risk profile, different mindset, different money in the bank, like different everything. So we need to remove the noise and control what's in our backyard. What can we control? And then we design a strategy from there. So, and I think when you explain it that way and ask some key questions for their own individual situation, they soon realize that what their friend just bought actually doesn't apply to them anyway.
So I suppose you teased out a couple of key points. One is how old you are, because that speaks to your investment time horizon. Another one is your remuneration. What have you got to be able to service a mortgage? Are they some of the real key starting points for mapping out that plan? And is there anything else that you think sort of fits in that at the beginning as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a client this morning who are based in Sydney looking to buy somewhere. We don't know where yet. And they're tossing up, they've got a max borrowing capacity of around 1.2. And they're wondering whether a 700, 800K purchase is going to be better than a 1.1, 1.2 purchase.
Yep.
A lot of investors or owner occupiers for that matter will go and buy what the bank tells them they can borrow, which is fraught with
maximum,
danger.
right?
Yeah. We must be cool with that because the bank's told me that I can lend it, so I'll just go and do that.
Yep.
So we need to strip that back and say, well, okay, is a $1.1, $1.2 million property going to perform better than a 700 to 800K property? History tells us that it probably does. But does that apply to our strategy if the yield's going to be lower because the purchase price is higher? Then that's where we need to strip it back and say, okay, I'm going to be $2,500 out of my pocket each month. Now that's going to hurt me. I've got no lifestyle, can't go out for dinner, can't go on a holiday, those sort of things. So then we get that middle ground to say cash versus growth, which one's more important, but which one's not going to blow me up? Because I think a lot of investors, if they sell within the first 2 or 3 years of buying, it's not because they have had outstanding growth, it's because they can no longer afford it and they're blaming the property as impacting their lifestyle.
Do you think there's an aspect of, well, if the bank's saying today I can get 1.2, I better get it because they might change their mind next time I go for it. It's like there's this capacity that they sort of they don't have any control of. So it's like, oh, they've said I can get this, so let's max that out because who knows what'll change in the future. Do you think that's part of it, or it's just like I can borrow this, so like more investing is better?
Yeah, I think we as humans, we look, what can we do today and tomorrow, not maybe next year or next 10 years. And I think we need to get out of our own environment and look 5 to 10 years in advance and say, yeah, maybe I can borrow the 1.2 mil today. However, my wife's going to be on maternity leave probably in the next 2 years. So we're only going to be down to one income for a period of time, or I'm maybe changing jobs, or I maybe want to start my own business, or I maybe want to go on a holiday, or maybe want to do a renovation on my home. So if we start to think 3-5 years in advance, then we get to think, well, no, spending that 1.2 now, although the banks have said we can do it, it's probably not going to be that wise because of what's happening into the future.
Yep. Now, the property market at the moment is, it's quite unusual. I would say in many respects, it's not like I've seen in my sort of property career. We've got places like WA that is just going absolutely bananas to the point where it's kind of like 2% a month. You can almost set your watch to it in the core logic figures. You got Brisbane and Adelaide that there's many pundits saying is the peak of the market. We've got Melbourne and Victoria is this sleeping giant that's been underperforming, and the politicians have been whacking with minimum standards legislation and no cause of evictions, and of course land tax and those sorts of things. One thing that is clear is that the property investors are looking more to Australia as their hunting ground for investment properties, whereas it used to be something, around the corner from where they live, they're a little bit more comfortable with. How do people make sense of all of the media around these locations, all of the companies that hotspot different different places around the country. Is that something that you think people come to you with a bit of analysis paralysis on? And if so, how do you guide them?
Totally. Yeah, it's the biggest, I suppose, the biggest positive is the biggest negative right now in 2024. Like when I started investing in 1999, there was no internet, or not
Right.
at least where I was living anyway. So we had a property investor magazine that we'd look once a month. We'd go to the back of the magazine and check the capital growth and the yields and all these sort of things, and we'd almost throw a dart at a dartboard. Fast forward to now, we've got massive information on a number of levels. We've got so many different companies that produce suburb location data. We've got friends and family. It's like raising a child. Everyone's an expert as a parent. Everyone's an expert as a property investor. And I think we look externally way too much as opposed to looking internally to say, what can I control and what sort of things do I need to get right first before I go and look at all those externals. And we put way too much focus on the media or the actual location that we're going to invest in. Does that mean that the location's not important? Absolutely not. We knew that in 2020, Perth property prices were the same as what they were in 2014 or 13. So the affordability was there for the property prices to go whack, and that's what they've done. So we need to understand historically where a market has come from, and not just historically as in the last 2 to 3 years. We need to look back 10, 15, 20 years to be able to see what the trends and fluctuations have been through that time, to then understand what game you're prepared to play. But why I choose location as the last point is because if you know your long-term goals, if you know what your strategy is, you know what type of property you want to buy, you know what your maximum price point is, you know what sort of yield you're looking at, then you've eliminated probably 80 to 90% of all locations around the country anyway by designing a strategy that's right for you. The remaining 10% of locations, that's when we can focus in on doing the research on those and not just listen to the media about land tax in Victoria or the hype in WA.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that all just comes from the planning part of it, right? Once you realize I've got X much to spend, I've got this much time to do it, I'm going to need this kind of yield because while I like 2-minute noodles, probably not 3 meals a day.
Yeah.
And then, isn't it amazing how you realize that, well, Australia has shrunk into perhaps just a couple of little pockets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about it, a shameless plug. I released a book earlier in the year, and I talk about it a lot in that. Is like, well, get your 8-point strategy or your 8-point plan right first, and then you can start to go and do your research. But just make sure you know what you're looking at in your own life before you go outside.
And a very well-credentialed person to be writing a book, so there's certainly no shame in the plug. You've been an investor for 25 years. What can you share about your investment story that you think is a good kind of case study for people coming and chatting to you about, what's possible to do with property?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice, if I can give it, is to take action. You don't want to be sitting on the fence getting splinters for 3 to 5 years because you don't think 500K is going to get you anything that's worthwhile. $1 million property was 500K at one stage in its journey. So understand that in the early days, the properties are going to be at their lowest yield because rents generally increase over the journey of holding the property. And understand that as you move through your journey, it's going to be a long one. It's a 20 to 30 year journey that you'll take with property. That as you work through that, your assets are going to get better and better. So if you've got 2 or 3 older properties, 450, 500K of worth, then gradually over the time, you might replace them with better performing blue chip type assets. And arguably your best property in your portfolio will be probably the one you live in, because that's the taste that Australians have got, is live in the best possible place or the best possible dwelling that I can. But generally, if you can get into what we call that lifestyle phase with a positive cash flow portfolio, your mortgage paid off, and you've got assets that are continually performing for you, then the superannuation becomes a bonus. The shares become a bonus. You've got these assets to actually pass on through to next generations, and all of a sudden you've created a fork in the road moment that sets your generations up for years to come.
Yeah, absolutely, and the power of it over that sort of time horizon is massive, right? I mean, I read The Psychology of Money recently, and the percentage of wealth of people like the Berkshire Hathaway fella, Buffett, that's growing in the back end of his career just is absolutely mind blowing, right?
Yeah,
And isn't
yeah.
it? Sorry, John.
No, I was just going to say you're 100% correct. But early days when you're in the weeds, you can't. There's all these massively great stories out there that you feel intimidated by, or you've got FOMO around, or I need to act quicker, or I need to buy something better, and there's all these keep up with the Jones sort of moments that we go through. If you really just understand that you're on your own journey in this life, and you know that there's a 20-year pathway that you're working towards, then that 450k property that you just bought, okay, that was right for me. That at the time I couldn't go and buy a 700k property because I didn't have the lending. So it is what it is. Let's block the noise.
Absolutely. And it's funny when we talk about locations just ad nauseum. It's like, where's the next hotspot? But you're kind of talking about before, the portfolio might dictate the type of property that it needs. So you might get to a point where it's, you've done the cash flow things and you've got the opportunity for a blue chip one that would have been impossible to perhaps hold on, but you're confident in the capital growth prospects. Do you feel like that that location focus is a bit of, it's doing us a bit of a disservice as beginner investors, say?
Oh, 100%, Mike. I think, like, take a suburb like St Kilda in Melbourne. Housing prices the last 20 years doubled, then some. Like, they've had outstanding results. Units basically sat dormant for 10 years through that period. And if we just purely focused on the location, let's just go and buy in that particular location with the money I've got, then we might have got ourselves a one-bedroom unit in that suburb and woke up 10 years later and it's still worth the same amount. So, yeah, location. And look, for those companies out there that are listening in that provide location data, fantastic, like, continue that stuff. But as consumers, we need to be thinking, well, that's just one piece of the pie. I think the type of asset is just as important, if not more important, than the location itself. But more important, overriding the type and the location, is the individual themselves. Who are they? What do they want? Like, what's their overall situation?
Now, this is the point at the show where, in closing, I like to annoy my guests by crystal ball saying which location is going to outperform the rest of them. But because we've said location is not the panacea, it's just one part, it's the end, perhaps I'll be a little bit kinder on you and say the best advice for someone that's starting in property that doesn't want to be one of those 72.5% of people that only own one property because they don't understand the cash flow and are maybe forced to sell. What are some of the key things that you would have disseminated in your book that you think people need to know?
So I think there's a lot of indicators and almost too many indicators. Like, there's walk scores and location scores and, like, all these scores that are coming into the algorithms of it all now. And I think one stat that I like to look at is owner occupiers versus renters. Okay. Yep. Usually that's at about a 70 to 30 balance. If I see it at a 50-50 balance, there might be a bit of a concern there. I also like to see owner occupiers owned outright percentage. If I've got an unencumbered home where I've got no mortgage, then I'm not selling. I don't need to sell. I'm not going to be forced into distress when interest rates go from 2% to 6%. So there's just one example. I suppose we look at unemployment, we look at population growth, we look at economies and infrastructure. We don't want to go to an area that's just focused on one particular industry. So they're probably the main ones that we look at, but there's so many more little idiosyncrasies that we just need to include in that. And that's even before we actually start the search. And then a lot of the search is in, well, what things do we avoid? We don't want to be on busy roads. We don't want to be on massive slope of block. We got a strategy that says we want to add value. Okay, is the block size big enough? So a lot of this comes down to experience, and when you're working with someone that's only been in the industry 12 months, it's very hard to fast track that experience, because those that have been doing it for 15, 20, 25 years have seen so many different markets across so many different variables in so many different climates that you just can't replace that overnight.
Yeah, absolutely. A very, very erudite point. And I like, going back to a little while ago, I like that point about being decisive and not getting splinters in your backside by sitting on the fence. So I think also, if anyone's going to take anything out of this show, it's, the best time to invest was yesterday. And since that's not available, you've still got today left, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And two things stop you from investing. It's the ability to lend money, having a deposit, and the other is mindset. And I think the mindset is what stops a lot of people.
Yeah, awesome. Well, John, it's been a sincere pleasure, and I'd love to get you on the show again down the track, but thanks for joining us and sharing all of that gold today.
Pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers.